Does a sequel to an Ernest Hemingway short story stand on its own? Welcome to Strip Cover Lit, where we squeeze the bigger picture out of literature. I'm Adrian Ford, where we are here to discuss a short story which will appear in 3 separate short story playlists here on the channel. Number 1, the short story discussion playlist. Number 2, a short story by short story read along of Ernest Hemingway. And number 3, the Ernest Hemingway playlist, a playlist dedicated strictly to Ernest Hemingway. We're here to talk about Big Two-Hearted River Part 2 by Ernest Hemingway. The video will have 3 separate sections: a So What Happened section, a literary criticism section, and a writer's corner section. So let's get right into it. What happened? Nick wakes up, makes breakfast, catches some grasshoppers, and starts fishing. It's like half the short story right there. He catches a fish, but it's a small one, so he throws it back. So he casts again, and there is a tug on the line, a heavy one. Something big. It starts pulling hard, and Nick gets excited. I shouldn't have written it that way. But the biggest trout Nick had ever seen jumps out of the water, and when it splashes back into the water, Nick's leader breaks. He goes on to smoke a couple cigarettes, catch a couple good-sized trout, and he cleans them, guts them, but he does not make his way into the swamp where he figures there could be bigger fish. That will be there for another time. So, what are we talking about with this short story? Well, I think if this short story is going to stand on its own, it has to have its own metaphors. It has to have its own sort of casting of what Nick is doing, right? It has to have its own way of telling that part of things. And I think that it does. Here on 175 and 176, we get this. Pardon me. There was a tug on the line. Nick pulled against the taut line. It was his first strike. Holding the now living rod across the current, he brought in the line with his left hand. The rod bent in jerks, the trout pumping up against the current. Nick knew it was a small one. He lifted the rod straight up in the air. It bowed with the pull. He saw the trout in the water jerking its head and its body against the shifting tangent of the line in the stream. Nick took the line in his left hand and pulled the trout, thumping tiredly against the current, to the surface. His back was mottled the clear, water-over gravel color. His side was flashing in the sun. The rod under his right arm, Nick stooped, dipping his hand into the current. He held the trout never still with the moist right hand, while he unhooked the barb from his mouth, then dropped him back into the stream. He hung unsteadily in the current, then settled to the bottom beside a stone. Nick reached down, his hand to touch him, his arm to the elbow under water. The trout was steady in the moving stream, resting on the gravel beside a stone. As Nick's fingers touched his smooth, cool, underwater feeling, he was gone in a shadow across the bottom of the stream. He's all right, Nick thought. He was only tired. That trout there is Nick, or at least it's how he feels about himself. Nick feels he is the small fish in the big stream, life passing him by, and he just needs a moment to rest. That is the metaphor as extended from, however, the Big-Hearted River Part 1, where we understand that Nick is not quite at rest with his own life. This short story, on its own, not read in conjunction with Big-Hearted River Part 2, or part one, pardon me, this metaphor can be anything. This could be his love life. This could be the women that he finds. This could be the woman that he's in love with and he doesn't think their lives are compatible. It could be anything. The metaphor itself still stands, but to understand what I think the extended metaphor actually is, we have to read this in conjunction with Big Hearted River Part 1. Now, 176 to 177, this is, of course, in the Fincavigia edition. The next fish that he catches. As he put on pressure, the line tightened into a hardness, and beyond the logs a huge trout went high out of the water. As he jumped, Nick lowered the tip of the rod, but he felt as he dropped the tip to ease the strain, the moment when the strain was too great, the hardness too tight. Of course, the leader had broken. There was no mistaking the feeling when all spring left the line and it became dry and hard, then went slack. His mouth was dry, his heart down. Nick reeled in. He had never seen so big a trout. There was a heaviness, a power not to be held. And then the bulk of him. As he jumped, he looked like a salmon. Nick's hand was shaky. He reeled in slowly. The thrill had been too much. He felt, vaguely, a little sick, and thought it would be better to sit down. Here, extended from the first Big Two-Hearted River story, we understand that what is going on here is that Nick has seen the life that he wants, the life that his friend left his friend group to enjoy, that has sent Nick on a downward emotional spiral, a downward spiral of self-consciousness, and made him have to take his own time, take his time away from the world. And just as his friend hitting it big made Nick have to sit down and reassess his life, here, when he hits the big trout, he sees the big life. Afterwards, he has to sit down and catch his breath, just like that fish, the little fish that he caught. Then Nick goes on to catch 2 medium-sized fish for himself, 2 trout that are good trout, not too big, not too small, just Goldilocks, just right. Each one of his fish is fine. Each one of his fish represents half of his life. Those 2 fish that he decides to take, to gut, to clean, to eat, one is his wilderness life, one is his home life, wherever it is, whatever it is that he does. So he has 2 lives, he has 2 fish, and each one of them are just fine. Not too small, not that he has to throw back, but certainly not the fish that makes his way out to the swamp. Now, hold on. Yeah. 179 and 180. We get another part of an interesting metaphor here. Ahead, the river narrowed and went into a swamp. The river became smooth and deep, and the swamp looked solid with cedar trees, their trunks close together, their branches solid. It would not be possible to walk through a swamp like that. The branches grew so low. You would have to keep almost level with the ground to move at all. You could not crash through the branches. That must be why the animals that lived in the swamps were built the way they were, Nick thought. He wished he had brought something to read. He felt like reading. He did not feel like going into the swamp. He looked down the river. A big cedar tree slanted all the way across the stream. Beyond that river went into the swamp. Now, if we flash back a little bit earlier in the story, if I can find it, because I did not I did not highlight it. We have the moment that the big fish gets away. As he put pressure on the line, as he put on pressure, the line tightened into a sudden hardness. Beyond the logs, a huge trout went high out of the water. Beyond the logs is where Nick describes the swamp as being. Now, here is something interesting to take away from the context of the story. That big trout ran away from Nick. It went into the deep water, it went into the swamp. That is a metaphor for the wilderness, for the rough patch, for the wild part of life. That's where you have to go to be successful. You have to traverse the wild parts. That is how you show mastery over your life. You have to, the big successful male trout that gets away, the big alpha male that gets away. He is willing and able to go into the dangerous wild of the swamp. Nick, feeling like the small trout, does not go into the wilderness. His friend that had found himself the good life goes out into the wilderness of the working world, goes into the wilderness of business, not college, not class, but business, goes to the cutthroat world of business and finds his own way. He masters that wilderness. And so he is the big trout of Nick's friend group. Nick decides not to do that. Nick decides that he is okay. Nick stood up on the log, holding the rod. The landing net. I can't read today. Nick stood up on the log, holding his rod, the landing net hanging heavy, then stepped into the water and splashed ashore. He climbed the bank and cut up the woods toward the high ground. He was going back to camp. He looked back. The river just showed through the trees. There were plenty of days coming where he could fish the swamp. So Nick understands that difficult part, that wilderness, the forest, here's the forest of the lake, right? The forest of the river. But the forest, metaphorically, the desert, metaphorically, is there to be conquered. And that's what makes you the alpha male. That's what makes you the big, strong man. Nick looks at it and says, tomorrow. And that's why Nick is not the alpha male, the big, strong man. Nick is alone in the woods trying to regroup. Nick is the small trout at the bottom of the stream having to take a rest. Now, that's kind of metaphorically what I think the whole thing is about here. But there's one more thing I want to talk about with that final paragraph there. Nick stood up on the log holding his rod. Well, if there's not a metaphor there, I don't know where one is. The landing net hanging heavy. Well, if there's not a metaphor there, I don't know where one is. Then stepped into the water and splashed ashore. He climbed the bank and cut up into the woods, toward the high ground. He was going back to camp. He looked back. The river just showed through the trees. There were plenty of days coming where he could fish the swamp. The last thing that is kind of worth taking away from that for me is this. How long is Nick staying in the woods? How long is Nick staying away from society? How long is Nick going to be doing what he's doing? How long does he plan to be there? Does he plan to ever leave? Does Nick plan on this being his final adventure? I think there's something to be asked about that. I think that there are hints in these two stories that Nick is kind of tired of life, that Nick is kind of done. He's ready to go away from polite society in general. I think that there are hints to be had here that Nick is not looking forward to the rest of anything. So now we do get other Nick Adams stories, so I'm not saying he carries through with that endeavor, but I'm saying that I think that there is something to be said for that interpretation of this short story. Now, as far as the writer's corner is concerned here, without part one, I do think that this short story stands on its own. I do think that this short story is an actual short story. It does function as a full story. You don't have to have that first portion. But what I don't know is if without that first portion, you care. I think that it would be very easy to toss this short story aside and never get to the good stuff in the middle here if you don't have that first portion to be more invested in Nick's stories. Now, I don't know. I have no way of knowing, if this is how it was written or not, but it seems to me, Hemingway didn't do a whole lot of part one, part twos. Hemingway didn't write 3 novel series, right? Seems to me that this story might be broken up the way it is, instead of both of these being one short story, because each of them does stand on its own as far as the metaphorical content is concerned. I think that you can get your own interpretation from this story without knowing anything about the first one. I think that it's possible. You can look at this story, and like I said, those trout mean whatever it is those trout stand for. I don't know that you have to have the first short story for that to necessarily... I think you have to have the first short story to get the interpretation that I gave in this video. I don't think you have to have the first short story in order to find an interpretation for those trout. As an author, as a writer ourselves, that is an important question, because it seems this could have been one short story, and then Hemingway looked at it and said, if I cut this right here, I add an ending to the first part and a beginning to the second part, boy, those two stand alone. Now, that's interesting. It's an interesting practice. It's interesting if you have your own avenue for publishing. You're probably not going to get that published in that way. Number 2 here, the profound is buried in this story. Whatever those trout mean to you, those trout mean. And you can figure out any number of ways to interpret them, but it's there. Certainly, it's there. Do you trust the reader enough, as does Hemingway? Do you trust the reader enough to plant the profound in your short story and not only never point to it? Hemingway never gives us any hints or ideas about what it is he thinks that these trout represent. Can you do it, and can you put the profound in your short story? A, not point to it, but B, put it in there so slick, and C, kind of bury it. There's just a bunch of gunk at the beginning of this short story. Stuff we don't really care about. He wakes up, he makes himself some coffee, he's got some apple butter, he puts whole sandwiches in his pocket, because who doesn't? And then he goes and fishes. And then he dips his sandwich in the water and eats it. All this weird stuff going on, all of these things going on in the woods, and we don't care about any of it. We have no reason to care about any of it, especially if we're finding the short story on its own. We have no reason to care about it, because who is this character? Do you trust your reader enough to do those things? Do you trust your reader enough to put in a slow beginning to a story? Do you trust your reader enough to plant the profound and never point to it? Do you trust your reader enough for these things. I don't know that I do. I don't think I have that patience, you know? And then number 3 here, there is a lot of non-action in this story. Oh, Nick smokes a cigarette. Maybe Nick kills a grasshopper. It's not action. Nick walks down the stream. It's not action. It's movement. Hemingway was very quick to tell us, do not confuse movement for action. So there's a lot of non-action in this story. And I think, and this is going to sound horrible to say, I think lesser writers than Hemingway would be confused into putting non-essential writing in this story. Because there is so little action, I think they would be convinced that what they have to do is fill the pages with Nick's thoughts. We don't really get a whole lot of that. We are left to interpret Nick's thoughts through the ways that he frames things. We are left to interpret Nick's feelings through the ways that he observes things. Not in ideas, but things. Nick does not tell us, I am sad. Nick looks at the river and finds the death inside it. Nick does not tell us that he feels small. He catches the small trout, puts it back in the water, and then he's worried about it. That tells us that he empathizes with the small trout. Nick does not tell us that he wants the good life, but does not feel that he can get it. He momentarily catches the big trout and is upset, but not surprised when it gets away. Hemingway gives us these things without making them sentimental. That is all I have for this, a short story by short story read-along for Big Hearted River Part 2 by Ernest Hemingway. The next video in this series will be The Undefeated. If you like or appreciate what it is that I do here, hitting the like button really does help me out, as it tells YouTube to share this video with other literature lovers. And if you find yourself here by chance but not design, literature is the only thing I talk about on this channel, so consider hitting that subscribe button to stick around for more videos in the future. And as always, I hope to have you back for the next one.